Good morning, everyone. Today I want to fly from Frankfurt to Hamburg, Germany with you. It's a flight I took when I was about 9 years old. I think the first flight I ever, or it was the first flight I ever did on a passenger airliner back then, late 70s. It was 727, I think. And of course, that was a very memorable trip. My grandparents picked me up at the airport in Hamburg. And we're not flying a 727 today, we're flying the 737. And the emphasis of this video will be the fuel system. So before we get going, let's take a quick look. It's not that complicated, but there are a couple things that or that are quite interesting, I think. First, we have the fuel gauges for the center tank and the wing tanks, and of course we have the fuel quantity test button, and it doesn't work right now. It normally cycles through a bunch of displays. Here we have a problem with one of the timers in the gizmo code, and we're going to rectify that shortly. So, but the function of the fuel system is not affected just because the quantity test button doesn't work. But of course, we'd like to get that fixed. Now, another button is the fuel used button. It's up here. You will get the fuel used indication here when the engines run. And after the flight is done, you will usually push the fuel used button to reset that, and they will revert back to zero. The fuel panel is up here on the overhead panel, and from top to bottom you have the fuel valve indicator lights, you have the fuel temperature in Celsius, you have the crossfeed that you can use, and you have a symbology here that represents certain lines that go from the left wing tank and the right wing tank and the center tank to the fuel manifold. It's basically this horizontal line here, and then it goes to the left engine and to the right engine. And of course, I already mentioned the fuel pumps. You have one pump in each or two pumps in each tank. You have an aft pump and a forward pump, and they are all supplied by different electric suppliers. So even if you have a problem with, let's say, one generator dropping offline, you can see that only one pump here is affected in the left center tank. And even if the automatic bus transfer would not work, now you would see we would have a problem, because then one side does not have any fuel pressure anymore. But as you will see in a minute, that is not really a big problem either. The pump pressure coming from the center tank is a lot higher than the pump pressure from the wing tanks. So whenever the center fuel tank pumps are on, they will overpower the other pumps, and they will pressurize or push the fuel out of the center tank first. Why is that important? Because we never want to fill up or have fuel in the center tank unless or the wing tanks are completely full, and this is has to do with the bending moment of the wings. If the center of the aircraft where the passengers are and the center fuel tank is too heavy, it will bend the wings too much, and basically the fuel in the wings will counter that, or will not cause that much bending moment or bending force. So the what we call the standard fueling pattern is always fill up the wing tanks first, and once they are full, they have about 4,500 kilograms each, then you will start putting fuel into the center tank. Now, how do you fuel the IXEG 737? We do get once in a while someone saying, hey, I tried flight, edit, weight and balance, and here's the fuel tanks, and I just want to put some into the center tank, and I click done and apply changes, and nothing happens. Well, this is because the fuel system, like many other systems, is done by us in the custom code, and we overwrite the fuel values that Explain tries to write. So to access the fuel levels or to influence the fuel levels, you'll have to use the IXEG menus. You bump the mouse to the left side, and you have two ways to set it. The standard way, I would almost say, is go to ground services. You basically call the fuel truck. You can, if you want to play it really realistic, you can also go to the flight interphone and then go to actually service interphone, and then oops, here we go, I can't hear him. There we go. Oh no, sorry, flight interphone it is. So okay, we're adding the doors later on, and then if you, of course you need to hear the guy, then you can go to intercom or RT, and then if you have the flight interphone selected and also enable hearing the guy on the ground, then you can do it this way, or you can also call him on the ground call button, and then he will also come up, but it's easiest to just bump the left side here. So here you can, let's look at the fuel panel while I do that. Here you can set the fuel level, and if you say refuel to let's say 9 or 10 tons, then of course you go instant, it goes right away, you get full wings, and the remainder is going to go in the center tank. And if you say let's not take so much, let's take only 6 tons, instant of course the center tank is empty. But maybe you want to really set this up in a way that you want to set it up. Maybe you want to pretend that someone messed up and refueled the plane not in the standard way. Then of course you can go to pre-flight, and on the pre-flight menu you can influence exactly every single fuel tank and set it up. But bear in mind, if you click apply settings like I do now, the plane does reset completely. So if you've already fed your FMC here with the routing and everything, and if you do that, everything is gone. So this is really a pre-flight menu. Do it before you board the aircraft. If you're in the operations center and order the fuel, that's basically where you would do the pre-flight, and then you get to the aircraft and it's already fueled just in the way that you specified. And now you can try to deal with the situation. Now the weight is a little bit different. You can set the weight, of course, in the pre-flight menu here where the zero fuel weight is. You can also set it in the ground services menu. There's the zero fuel weight buttons down here. But you can also set the weight actually in the X-plane menu, where you can say, hey, payload weight, I want this to go up really high. You click done, apply changes, and now the plane suddenly is a lot more heavy. If you go to ground services to check, you can see the zero fuel weight just increased to 47.7 tons. So now it's really heavy. It works that way, but nevertheless, just to keep the confusion out of the picture, I recommend to always set it with the IXEG menu, and then you know where you're at. Now, if you really want to understand what's going on in your fuel tanks, you can actually enable the output. I will do that in a second, but let's look at another peculiarity of the fuel low pressure warning lights up here. You can see the center fuel pumps are off. We do have some fuel in the center tank, but the pumps are off, they're not running, and still the low pressure lights are out. Well, this is normal for the center fuel tank low pressure lights. They will only illuminate if the pump is on and the and it doesn't put out any pressure. And this is done because a lot of times you will fly around with the pumps and off, most of the time actually because you don't have fuel in the center tank, and then you wouldn't want these to be on all the time like they would be in case of the wing tanks. You can see now they illuminate if you turn the pumps to off, and they don't put out any pressure. This is the difference between the center pump low pressure lights and the wing tank pump low pressure lights. And there's another thing. If you just turn off one, you can see it triggers the warning light, but if you look down here, it does not trigger any master caution. The fuel should be on. If I click on recall, the fuel goes on, but if it triggers by itself, you see nothing happens. Now why is that? Because we have two pumps in each tank, one aft, one forward, and if the plane pitches up or accelerates, the fuel will surge towards the back, and often the forward pump uncovers in that case, or the same is in the descent. If the the fuel is not that full anymore and you pitch the nose down, the fuel will rush forward, the aft pump will uncover, and we don't want the pilots to get startled all the time by getting the low pressure master caution trigger here. So it will only trigger, let's zoom back a little bit, it will only trigger if two of these lights are illuminated at the same time. That's when you get the master caution fuel. It does work when you push recall, then it will go on and then you can check why it is. Now another limitation of the fuel system is we don't want fuel in the center tank unless it's at least 450 kilograms. We have enough now. The reason is, of course, we don't want the pumps to run dry, and if they have chafed wires or something like that, this may cause a hazard. Remember TW8 800, the 747 that exploded off New York. They traced that back to this cause, so they want the center tank to always stay covered in, or the center tank pumps to always stay covered with fuel, so they don't run dry and don't run in the vapor of the fuel. Now, modern aircraft do actually introduce nitrogen into the tank so that this cannot happen. The 737 Classic doesn't do that, so you just have to be super careful with that. Now, another thing, another special peculiarity about the fuel tank, of course, is, let's turn this on, is the so-called fuel scavenge pump, the center tank scavenge pump. I'm going to turn on a data ref output here. I think it's 62. It's called fuel weights. And if you have that out there, then you can actually see exactly what is happening in which fuel tank. You can see fuel 1, 2, and 3. 2 is the center tank, and this is getting drained right now because the APU is running, and the APU is connected somewhere over here. It's not displayed in the symbology, but it's connected to the left manifold. So right now the center pump is the strongest, and it's pushing fuel out of the center tank into the APU, and that's why you can see that drain. And if I turn it off, it does take a second, and then you can see it starts draining from the left fuel pump, because now these two pumps put out enough pressure to push it into the APU. And if I would open the crossfeed and turn these off, and then you can also power or fuel the APU from the right wing tank. We'll play a bit with the crossfeed during the flight to see how that works. But for now, I want to show you one more special thing. If the fuel pumps run dry in the center tank and you start getting the low pressure lights, then what we do is we turn off both fuel pumps, and this triggers what they call the scavenge pump. The scavenge pump is a little jet pump. It is actually driven by fuel pressure from this left tank forward fuel pump, and it will suck for about 20 minutes, suck out the last remaining little bit of fuel that is in the center tank. You can see that up here. The center tank is draining, yes, partly due to the APU, but mostly you can see the left fuel tank is filling up with fuel from the center tank. It runs for 20 minutes, and you can trigger it by turning one on and then off, either one. And then if the forward one is running, see if I turn it off, this process stops and you only get drain again from the left tank because the APU is using fuel. So this is something to keep in mind. Sometimes you will turn these off and then people say, hey, why is my left wing tank quantity increasing? Excuse me, well, this is because of the scavenge pump is working. Okay, fast forward to the takeoff position, runway 07 center, and let's take off on our flight to Hamburg. And this time we're going to watch what happens with the fuel pumps during the takeoff run. So I'm going to move up the view a little bit. You can already see that the forward pumps are both uncovered. However, there's no master caution associated with them. And of course they will stay uncovered during the initial climb. That's perfectly normal and happens a lot of times. Okay, here we are again in route. Okay, we're at cruising level 290 on the way north, and let's see what happens. I actually added some more fuel. We have a little bit of fuel now in the center tank. It's about to run out. You can see that both center tank pumps are on. Crossfeed is closed, and I re-enabled the fuel display up here, so you can see what happens when actually the center tank pumps run dry. Of course, one is going to run dry first and then the second one, and we're going to observe what happens. You can see first one low pressure light comes on. Again, one low pressure light does not trigger the warning, and what we would do in this case, we'd open the crossfeed so that now the remaining pump can fuel both engines, and we would turn the low pump off, of course. And now see the first one is also flickering. It's just siphoning off the last few drops of fuel, but now what we do is we turn it off as well. And now look at the fuel quantity in the center tank. It's still diminishing even though both pumps are off. Well, this is the jet scavenge pump that's working with fuel pressure from the forward pump, and it's siphoning off the last bits of fuel off the center tank. It runs for 20 minutes and adds the fuel to the left wing tank, tank number 1. So you can see that one is not diminishing, and the fuel is also actually, what is happening now is you can see that the fuel is coming out of the right wing tank, and that is because the crossfeed is open. And what happens is these pumps are a little bit stronger than these ones, so they actually overpower these pumps. So the manifold is dominated, so to say, by the pumps that are a little bit stronger. They used to think that with the crossfeed open, both pumps or both tanks would feed both engines. That's not what's happening. One set of pumps is always a little bit stronger, and this one will win. So to reinstate the tank to engine configuration, we'd have to cross the crossfeed, and now you will see in a second that fuel starts coming out of both wing tanks again. And of course the last 30 pounds are getting sucked out of the center tank, added to the left wing tank. So that is all working as it should. Now before we start the descent, I would like to show you what happens if you turn off the fuel pumps and nothing happens. The engines do get fed. Well, you know, the master caution comes on, but the engines do get fed with the so-called suction lines that connect the engines to the tanks. So even if the boost pumps, the fuel pumps fail, the engines won't quit. There may be thrust degradation, especially at higher altitudes when gases that are solved in the fuel bubble out, and they may clog these suction lines, but actually the engine does, the engines do not die, they do get fuel through these so-called suction lines. But let's turn these back on, and now you can see both tanks are draining. The left one a little bit slower because it still gets the fuel from the center tank. And we are approaching Hamburg. This is the Elbe River, and the Hamburg city is already up ahead. Today we're going to fly the localized approach to runway 33. Pretty unusual because you come in over the city, and they normally don't really like that because of noise, but today the wind is from the north and we twisted some arms, so they're okay with it. And you can see we're still in LNAV, just joining the extended center line and coming up on the localizer quite nicely. The VNAV prediction is going a little bit wild again, but I think it will stabilize by the time we get to Sosax, and then we'll be able to fly the localizer. Normally on the localizer approaches you get a certain distance associated with your altitude, and you can determine the vertical path that way. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to arm the localizer, and this is the big difference. In a localizer approach you do not click approach because you don't want the glide slope to arm. You just click on the VOR lock, and that captures the localizer, which gives you a more precise lateral guidance than just an RNAV approach would. Just as precise as an ILS approach, but of course you do not have a vertical path. Now I'm going to reduce speed to 180. We're coming up on Sosax, which is the final descent point, basically, and especially with non-precision approaches, you do not want to rush in. I'm going to set the altitude to 4,000. This enables me to use vertical speed in a second. That would not work if I'm still at 3,000. And I'm going to enable the vertical speed now and start going down on it. And here goes flaps 1. And maybe 1,200 is sufficient for now. And go to flaps 5 to help with slowing down. Here we are at Sosax. Should be 3,000. I'm still a little bit high. And of course there's the city up ahead, and there's the runway up ahead as well. So my distance is 7 miles. I should be at 2,100. Still pretty high. Let's help with the gear and reduce speed even further. Go to 150.
2,500.
2,500 is checked. We're below 195 knots. I can now go to flaps 15. And reduce the speed all the way to final approach speed 139. Go to flaps 25. Still 4 wide. And flaps 30 final setting. Disconnect speed mode. I'm in manual control of my thrust levers. Reduce rate to 1,000 feet. And do the final checklist. Start switches, continuous, speed brake, armed, green light, gear down through green, flaps 30, green light. Final checklist completed. Zero land.
1,000.
Coming up on the glide path here, 4 white, 4 red. Speed is looking good as well. I'm still on autopilot, still guiding with the localizer. About 53% is my target power. Coming a little low, reducing the rate, and the minimum would be about 300. I did not check it now, but
500.
can go as low as 250 feet above the threshold. So now the runway is well in sight, so I'm going to disconnect the autopilot and continue the flight manually.
400. 300. 200.
I'm using real weather, but I always switch it to manual after it loaded and then add just a tiny bit of turbulence. Makes it a
100,
little bit more realistic.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
And here we are. Idle reverse. They really don't like you to make a lot of noise here in Hamburg. And manual brakes. And here is the Echo 3 turnoff, which will take us back to the terminal. That's the lazy man's way of retracting the speed brake, just gunning the thrust levers for a second. And as usual, when I'm by myself, I stop when I'm off of the runway, set the brake, and then do the after landing items. And it's time to turn off the strobes. I had those on while crossing runway 23. And of course you want to turn off taxi lights and turn off lights as you come into the stand. Let's check our positioning. Well, we can go a little bit further. And that should be fine. Set the parking brake and cut off engine number 2. They'll bring the ground power from that side. And there it is. And this concludes the flight to Hamburg.